By the year 981, one man had made himself the undisputed master of the most powerful state in the Western Wall. He was not a caliph, not a prince, yet Muhammad ibn Abi Amir, known to history as Almanzor, held the Caliphate of Córdoba in the palm of his hand. And with that power, Almanzor turned his gaze northward, toward the Christian kingdoms that had long nibbled at the edges of al-Andalus. What followed was 2 decades of almost unrelenting military terror. I'm David Cott, host of New History of Spain, and this is the story of Almanzor and al-Andalus at the height of their power. Exploiting Christian division, León, 981 to 985. With the internal politics of Córdoba firmly under his control, the Haji, or Prime Minister Almanzor, could now direct his formidable war machine outward. His strategic objectives in the Christian north were not simply conquest for its own sake. Almanzor wanted to convert the Kingdom of León into a tributary satellite state, to position Córdoba as the supreme arbiter of Iberian politics, and to keep the Christian realms perpetually destabilized, weak enough to be milk for tribute and slaves, strong enough that their subjugation remained a source of ongoing prestige. What he found in the early 980s was an opportunity almost too good to manufacture. The Kingdom of León was tearing itself apart. In December of 981, Bermudo II, son of King Gordoño III, rose in rebellion against the reigning king, Ramiro III. The revolt took hold in northern Portugal under the protection of Count Gonzalo Menéndez. By October of 982, Bermudo II had been consecrated king in Santiago de Compostela, backed by a broad coalition of magnates, bishops and abbots from the western reaches of the kingdom. Ramiro III was not yet finished, but the kingdom was now split. While Bermudo and Ramiro fought for their position in an indecisive battle, the Hajib launched his first major campaign against León itself, seizing the town of Toro and devastating the suburbs of the royal seat. He was not trying to conquer León outright, not yet. He was carefully, deliberately weakening Ramiro while allowing Bermudo to consolidate. The campaigns that followed were relentless. In the summer of 983, Almanzor struck Simancas and demolished its walls. Ramiro's right-hand man was killed in the fighting, and thousands of captives were marched south to Córdoba. Ramiro attempted to ransom them. The reply that came back was devastating. The male prisoners had already been executed. In September of that same year, Almanzor took Salamanca, forcing the walled city to capitulate after its suburbs were stormed. 2 months later, his forces swept through Segovia and the county of Monzón, leaving massacre in their wake. In March of 984, the inhabitants of Zamora paid a substantial tribute to buy off the Emirate army rather than face assault. By summer, Sepúlveda, the southernmost stronghold of the county of Castile, was taken by siege engines and razed to the ground, erasing years of Christian territorial gains south of the Douro River. Each blow fell on territory loyal to Ramiro III. Each blow made Bermudo II look, by contrast, like the safer bet. This was not coincidence. Almanzor was playing kingmaker, and by the spring of 984 his investment paid off. Bermudo seized León itself. Ramiro fled to Astorga and died in a nearby village in June of 985, so disgraced that he wasn't even buried in the Astur-Leonese dynastic pantheon. The deal Bermudo struck with Almanzor was a frank acknowledgement of the new order of things. He agreed to pay an annual tribute and accepted a garrison of Muslim soldiers to help suppress his internal opponents. Those soldiers were expelled by Bermudo less than a year later, as their behavior was causing too much trouble. But what's clear is that Córdoba continued to intervene decisively in the politics of the north. The Barcelona Campaign of 985. Almanzor opened a second front in the northeast. He had raided the Catalan counties before, but the Barcelona Campaign of 985 was something else. The timing was deliberate. Barcelona's ties to the Carolingian kings of West Francia had been fraying for years, and the chronicler Ibn Khaldun notes that the campaign was launched precisely when it had become clear the people of Barcelona could no longer count on Frankish protection. The city was, in effect, alone. Almanzor's forces passed through the defensive network of castles and watchtowers the Catalan counts had built between Tarragona and Barcelona without serious difficulty. Before the walls of the city itself, an army led by Count Borrell II of Barcelona was intercepted and defeated. One Arab chronicler attributes the Muslim success in this engagement partly to an innovation. soldiers equipped with steel forearm guards brought from India, which blunted the impact of the feared Frankish swords. It's unclear whether Count Borrell led the defense of the city or if the task fell to Viscount Udalard. What we do know is that Borrell issued a call to arms to his subjects in the counties of Barcelona, Girona, Osona and Urgell to come defend Barcelona. However, the speed of the Muslim assault prevented a general mobilization from taking place. Barcelona's Roman-era walls held off the Andalusi attacks for 6 days. On July 6th, the Muslim-like cavalry managed to enter the city. The people of Barcelona had not surrendered, which under the laws of Islamic warfare meant that the attackers were entitled to kill, enslave, and burn without restraint. And that is precisely what they did. The human cost was staggering. Prominent figures were taken captive, their freedom redeemable only at enormous ransom. The city's Jewish community suffered alongside its Christian neighbors. Several monasteries were devastated. The rich documentary record of medieval Catalonia traces many tragedies. Families wiped out entirely, captives who could only return home as late as 1002, returning prisoners who found their property had been seized by relatives who had assumed they were dead, and legal disputes over unpaid debts accumulated during years of captivity. Hundreds of slaves taken at Barcelona were put to work on the expansion of the Great Mosque of Córdoba. In the centuries that followed, Catalan chroniclers would claim that Barcelona died that day, that from the ashes of the city a new nation was born, one that had cut its ties to distant Frankish kings and forged its own identity through catastrophe. It is a compelling founding myth, and like most founding myths, it contains just enough truth to be misleading. First of all, archaeology was able to confirm that the destruction of Barcelona was exaggerated. The Counts of Barcelona had been functionally independent of Frankish authority since the time of Wilfred the Hairy at the end of the 9th century. What changed after 985 was not the fact of independence, but its formal acknowledgement. When the Frankish king Lothair received a plea for military assistance from Borrell II in the aftermath of the attack, he did not respond. He died shortly afterward, as did his son. When the new Capetian king, Hugh Capet, finally answered a renewed appeal in 988, he demanded that Borrell come personally to Aquitaine to swear fealty, a demand Borrell simply ignored. Neither man saw practical benefit in the relationship. Borrell had long used titles like Princeps or Duke of Gothia and Hispania. The year 988 was not the birth of Catalonia, but it was the moment when the fiction of Frankish suzerainty was quietly abandoned. What the campaign of 985 did produce, paradoxically, was an intensification of commercial ties between al-Andalus and the Catalan counties. The negotiations to ransom captives generated a dramatic increase in the circulation of gold in the region and a surge in the import of Andalusian manufactured goods and books. The ransoms forced many families to sell their assets, usually to religious institutions that had the liquidity to lend, accelerating the process of feudalization and deepening socioeconomic inequality in Barcelona society. Almanzor had come to destroy. What he left behind, among other things, was a richer and more unequal Catalonia. Relentless pressure on León, 986 to 995. The expulsion of the Muslim garrison from León that I mentioned before gave Almanzor all the pretext he needed to resume his assault on the Asturianese kingdom with renewed fury. In the summer of 986 came what the sources call the Campaign of the Cities. Salamanca, Alba de Tormes, and León itself were all occupied, and Zamora capitulated once again. King Bermudo II, who had owed his throne in part to Emirate support, now fled to the safer refuge of Galicia, where he would remain until March of the following year. The campaigns of the following years were relentless and systematic. In June of 987, after a siege of 3 days, the Portuguese city of Coimbra fell. The population was enslaved, the city repopulated with Muslims. Coimbra will not return to Christian hands for nearly 80 years, until 1064. Unlike most of Almanzor's campaigns, this was not a raid. It was a permanent reversal of the Christian advance. In 988, 2 major campaigns struck the heart of the Leonine realm to weaken the king and fuel revolts. Zamora was taken by a storm, and a Muslim garrison was installed, which was a big deal considering the city had been one of the most important ones of the kingdom. Astorga, situated close to León itself, was also seized. In the same campaign, the great monastery of Sahagún, the most important religious institution in the Leonese heartland, was sacked and burned. It was around this time that Almanzor nearly succeeded in replacing Bermudo II entirely. With immediate backing, a powerful magnate named García Gómez briefly governed León as king. He was the patriarch of the Banu Gómez family, which controlled the counties of Saldaña, Carrión, and Liébana. For several months, in early 990, documents were dated not by Bermudo's reign but by García Gómez's, in a co-governance arrangement with an emirate official installed in Toro, Zamora. It was the most dangerous moment of Bermudo's turbulent reign. He fled once again to Galicia and once again recovered his kingdom. By late June of 990, he was back in León, and García Gómez, with pragmatic flexibility, returned to his county and recognized Bermudo as king. We do not know the details of the reconciliation, though a catastrophic famine of this period and a conspiracy involving the Hajib's own son likely disrupted Almanzor's ability to support his ally. Within his own camp, Almanzor faced a more personal crisis. His firstborn son, Abdallah, bitter at being passed over as heir in favor of his younger brother Abdalmalik al-Muzaffar, conspired with the Lord of Zaragoza to overthrow his father. When the plot was uncovered, Abdallah fled to the protection of Count García Fernández of Castile. Almanzor's response was merciless. He conquered and settled Osma and devastated Castile until the Count had no choice but to hand over his son. In September of 990, Almanzor had Abdallah beheaded. In later conversations, the Hajib will reportedly cast doubt on whether Abdallah had ever truly been his son to the flag accusations of cruelty. In 994 and 995, the Banu Gómez territories were ravaged. And then, in May of 995, came an almost accidental stroke of fortune for Almanzor. A group of Andalusi cavalry raiding along the Douro frontier stumbled upon Count García Fernández of Castile traveling with a small retinue, and they captured him. The Muslims attempted to treat his wounds at Medinaceli, but he died and his head was sent to Córdoba as a trophy. García Fernández had been the most resilient of the Christian frontier lords, the men who had helped Bermudo stay in power and held Castile together through decades of emirate pressure, even expanding his county by annexing the county of Monzón. His death marked the end of an era. The submission of the Christian kingdoms. By the mid-990s, the political map of Christian Iberia had been comprehensively redrawn by Almanzor's campaigns, not through outright conquest, but through a sustained campaign of coercion that left no kingdom untouched and no ruler truly sovereign. The Kingdom of León's submission was formalized in the most humiliating terms. After the campaigns of 994 and 995, which led to the sacking of Astorga, the conquest of Clunia and San Esteban de Gormaz, and the occupation of León, King Bermudo II had no viable military response. He was compelled to pay the jizya, the tax levied on Christian communities living under Islamic rule. It was an extraordinary symbolic degradation. The county of Castile under Count Sancho García largely maintained a careful, submissive relationship with Córdoba in the years immediately following his father's death, because Sancho had previously rebelled against his father with emirate support and understood well what Almanzor's favor and fury looked like. The Kingdom of Pamplona's relationship with Almanzor oscillated between calculated submission and periodic defiance, always ending in the same place. King Sancho II had bought peace for nearly a decade by paying tribute and giving his daughter Abda to Almanzor's harem, a union that produced Abdelrahman Sanchuelo, who will play a crucial role in the eventual collapse of the emirate regime. When the agreement broke down in 991, Almanzor attacked La Rioja, seized Navarrese castles, and forced Sancho to sue for peace. He did not merely demand tribute. He compelled his father-in-law to help him with an incursion into Gascony and to travel in person to Córdoba to render homage. The king of Pamplona knelt and kissed the foot and hand of both the Hajib and his young grandson Sanchuelo, and Almanzor scolded him for his disobedience. Sancho's successor García II proved less compliant. In 994, he refused to pay tribute, and Almanzor punished him by sacking the Riojan city of Cantabria, near present-day Logroño, and executing 50 Navarrese hostages, including members of the royal family. One of them was executed by the young Abdelrahman Sanchuelo himself, barely 12 years old, in a pointed demonstration that kingship ties would offer no protection. García II eventually submitted, but defiance always returned, and in 999 Almanzor attacked Pamplona itself, occupying and plundering the city. García II died that same year. Almanzor's military reform. Behind every one of Almanzor's campaigns lay a military machine unlike anything seen in early medieval Iberia since the Muslim conquest. Understanding how he built it and what it ultimately cost al-Andalus is essential to understanding both his success and his legacy. The traditional backbone of the Andalusi military had been the Jans, regiments of Syrian Arab soldiers who had arrived in al-Andalus in the 740s. These were not full-time warriors. Most of the year they farmed, managed estates, and collected taxes from their districts, keeping a third of local revenues in exchange for their military service. When the emir or caliph called them up for a summer campaign, they came. It was a system that had served well for 2 centuries. The Arab Jans had their own leaders, their own solidarity networks, so their autonomy meant they were never as unconditionally loyal as the rulers of Córdoba wanted them to be. The Umayyads had already been chipping away at Jan power for decades. Al-Hakam I created a personal guard of Sakaliba, enslaved Europeans who, having no ties to the community, made far more reliable instruments of internal control. Abd al-Rahman III reformed the army to push volunteers and Arab Jans to the margins, replacing the leadership with freedmen loyal to the dynasty. Al-Hakam II imported fresh Berber mercenaries from the Maghreb in larger numbers. Each step moved in the same direction, away from soldiers with roots in Andalusi society and towards soldiers who owed everything to the men who paid them. Almanzor carried this process to its logical conclusion. During the 980s, as he consolidated his grip on the caliphate, he systematically dismantled the Jan system. The Arabs enrolled in the Jans lost their employment and their pay. The semi-professional, seasonally immobilized warrior farmers were replaced by a professional standing army of full-time soldiers mainly made up of foreigners, including Berbers freshly recruited from the Maghreb, Christian mercenaries from the northern kingdoms, sub-Saharan African slaves, and Sakaliba. Many of the latter were men and former children enslaved in Almanzor's own campaigns against the Christian north. The ethnic heterogeneity of the army was a deliberate policy. Almanzor wanted soldiers who could not easily unite against him. If the Berbers rebelled, the Christians and Sakaliba could suppress them. If the Sakaliba rose up, the Berbers could be turned against them. No single faction was large enough or coherent enough to threaten the regime. By 991, the number of recently arrived Berber soldiers already outnumbered Andalusi soldiers in the army. The skill of the military apparatus Almanzor built was extraordinary. Contemporary sources suggest the Caliphate maintained a professional standing force of around 20,000 cavalry and several thousand infantrymen, with additional troops that could be mobilized for major campaigns. State armories produced 12,000 bows and 30,000 shields annually. The Caliphate purchased 8,000 horses and 8,000 mules per year for military use. Contemporary estimates suggest Almanzor spent more than a third of state revenues on the military, and the fiscal pressure required to sustain it was enormous, falling heaviest on the Andalusi peasantry and generating widespread resentment. The jurist Abu Bakr al-Turtusi, writing at the end of the 11th century, accused Almanzor of pursuing a policy of short-term gain at catastrophic long-term cost. Raising taxes so steeply that fields were abandoned, fiscal revenues declined, and the social fabric of al-Andalus was stretched to breaking point. The king of the Taifa of Granada, Abdallah ibn Bulugin, himself a descendant of the Berber dynasties Almanzor had elevated, offered a more self-serving account, describing how the Andalusis had voluntarily exempted themselves from military service in exchange for paying taxes to fund mercenary replacements. The reality, as al-Turtusi understood, was rather less voluntary. The deepest damage caused by Almanzor's military reform was that it culminated the demilitarization of Andalusi society, which made them more unable to defend themselves without foreign soldiers. The new Berber soldiers arrived in tribal groups, speaking little Arabic, wearing turbans, and accustomed to urban life. They were perceived as foreigners in a society they were supposed to be defending, and racial hatred towards them grew among the Andalusis. When the Emirid regime eventually collapsed, those cohesive tribal units did not dissolve back into Andalusi society. Almanzor had built the most powerful army al-Andalus had ever fielded. In doing so, he had planted the seeds of its fragmentation. The Subh Crisis of 996. For all the drama of his campaign, some of the most consequential battles Almanzor fought were internal, including one confrontation with the woman to whom he owed everything. Subh was the mother of the puppet caliph Hisham II, and she had been in many ways the architect of Almanzor's rise. It was her patronage, her political intelligence, and her control of the palace finances that had propelled the young Muhammad ibn Abi Amir from ambitious bureaucrat to Hajib in the turbulent years following Al-Hakam II's death in 976. She had been the most powerful figure in Córdoba during the transition, but by the 990s, Almanzor had stripped away most of her formal functions, concentrating the bureaucracy at his own palace city of Madinat al-Zaira. But Subh retained one weapon that no administrative reorganization could easily touch: the state treasury and the caliph's private fortune. By 996, Hisham II was in his early 30s. What his mother wanted was for her son to actually govern. Almanzor was no longer a useful instrument, he was an obstacle. And so Subh began, carefully and secretly, to use the treasury to buy the allies she needed. With help from her brother, she moved money out of the palace and began cultivating support among the Saqaliba soldiers and, crucially, among Jiri ibn Atiyah, the powerful Berber chief who governed the Maghrebi territories under the Umayyad umbrella. She spread the rumor that Almanzor intended to eliminate the caliph. The goal was simple: enough support from Umayyad partisans to make a move. But Almanzor's spy network proved more reliable than his enemies hoped. When the conspiracy was uncovered, the Hajib moved with his characteristic combination of legal theater and raw force. He convened a council of ministers and jurists and secured unanimous approval to transfer the state treasury to Madinat al-Zaira. His son Abd al-Malik al-Muzaffar, leading 2,000 handpicked soldiers, then marched on the Alcázar of Córdoba on May 24th and caught Subh's brother and a group of Saqaliba soldiers red-handed, attempting to move 80,000 dinars hidden in jars beneath layers of honey. Abd al-Malik entered the palace and declared that anyone who would steal the sovereign's treasury preferred fitna over peace. A silence fell over the room. Nothing in Islamic political theology was more feared than fitna. Civil war among Muslims was, according to some traditions, a sin that barred its participants from paradise. Caliph Hisham, confronted by his own ministers, declared himself ignorant of the conspiracy and condemned anyone who had plotted against Almanzor. Over the following 3 days, Abd al-Malik transferred 5,780,000 dinars from the palace to Madinat al-Zaira. When the soldiers moved to seize the caliph's private fortune as well, Subh erupted. The accounts describe a scene of extraordinary intensity. Subh, her power stripped away piece by piece, unleashing a torrent of curses on Almanzor and all his descendants with such force and authority that Abd al-Malik stood in silence and let it wash over him. Her voice, the chroniclers tell us, still resonated with the power she had once held. But curses could not change political facts, and as a woman, Subh had everything against her. Left alone, Hisham was said to have sighed, then recited quietly, quote, "Is it not astonishing that someone like me should be deprived of the least trifle, and that though the whole world is governed in his name, he holds no power at all?" End quote. The crisis was more serious than the written sources let on. In Córdoba, there was an uprising of Saqaliba. In the Maghreb, Jiri ibn Atiyah openly rebelled, minting coins with his own name and rallying his forces in the name of the legitimate caliph. The revolt took 2 years to suppress, and with that suppressed, Almanzor was able to secure the flow of sub-Saharan gold that was vital to the Andalusi war machine and economy. The absence of campaigns against the Christian kingdoms in 996, the first such gap in 19 consecutive years of jihad, was the most visible sign of how seriously Almanzor's position had been shaken. By 997, the crisis had been resolved in al-Andalus and its resolution publicly performed with a procession, and Hisham II's recognition that he delegated the government to Almanzor and his descendants. Subh died the following year. The caliph, now without anyone caring for him, was moved to Madinat al-Zaira, placed even more firmly under Amirid control. Almanzor walked barefoot in Subh's funeral procession and donated 500,000 dinars at her tomb. Whether that generosity reflected genuine grief, calculated respect for the woman who had made him, or something in between, no source can say. The Santiago de Compostela Campaign of 997. The political crisis of 996 demanded a response that could only be delivered in one currency: a spectacular military victory. King Bermudo II of León had seized on the instability in al-Andalus to stop paying tribute. But more fundamentally, Almanzor needed to remind everyone, his soldiers, his enemies, the juries, the humble legitimes who had rallied around Subh, exactly why he was the man who should govern the most powerful state in the Western world. And so, he chose his target with care. Santiago de Compostela, the most important Christian pilgrimage site on the Iberian Peninsula. At 59 years old and despite health already beginning to fail, Almanzor departed Córdoba on July 3rd with cavalry alone to reach Compostela fast. The campaign was a logistical masterpiece. He passed through Coria and then Viseu, where he was joined by Christian counts, mostly from northern Portugal, who had calculated that collaboration with Almanzor was preferable to being in his path. At Porto, infantry troops arrived by sea from Alcácer do Sal, transported along with provisions and weapons. The fleet then sailed upriver along the Douro to a crossing point of Almanzor's choosing, where boats were lashed together to form a bridge. The march into Galicia was not without its anxieties. Almanzor suspected that his Leonese mercenaries might balk at attacking Compostela. His precautions revealed how seriously he took the risk. He posted a man on a road with orders to detain anyone who passed. An old farmer came by on a donkey, claiming he was going to cut firewood. He was brought before Almanzor anyway. When the Sacaliba soldiers searched the men's saddlebags, they found a letter in which Leonese soldiers serving in the Emirate army had written to their fellow Christians, detailing the weaknesses of the Muslim camp. The old man and the letter signatories were beheaded. The rest of the Christian contingent kept their heads down. The army then crossed the Miño River, sacked the fortress, raided an island off the coast where refugees had sought shelter, passed through the hills near Vigo, and after destroying an oratory dedicated to Santiago at Iria Flavia, they made camp on August 11th before the walls of Santiago de Compostela. The city was empty. Every inhabitant had fled. Over several days, the army was free to loot. They demolished the walls, burned the churches, and pulled down the great basilica built under Alfonso III of Asturias that had housed the sacred tomb. Almanzor gave one explicit order, however. The tomb of the Apostle James was not to be touched. Whether out of genuine religious scruple, fear of offending his Christian auxiliaries or God, or a calculated respect for the site's power to generate future tribute, the site was left intact. An old monk was found sitting beside it, saying he was there to honor Santiago. He too was left unharmed. After a week of destruction, the army began its return south. At Lamego, Almanzor distributed lavish gifts of Andalusi silk and luxury textiles to the Christian counts who had accompanied him, dismissing them in order of rank. The propagandists of Córdoba presented the campaign as a triumph over all of Christendom. Later Christian sources will claim that the bells of Compostela were carried to Córdoba on the backs of Christian captives, to be melted down and hung as lamps in the Great Mosque, a story almost certainly invented in the 12th century. The Battle of Cervera, when Almanzor nearly lost. By the year 1000, the Christian kingdoms had suffered 20 years of systematic devastation, but they had not been conquered. And as Almanzor prepared what would prove to be one of his most dangerous campaigns, the counts and kings of the north were finally finding the will to fight back together. The immediate cause was Sancho García of Castile. The young count had maintained his careful deference to Córdoba since inheriting his title after his father's capture and death in 995. Now he broke with it. He stopped paying tribute and, more dangerously, began encouraging other Christian magnates to do the same. Almanzor set out to punish him, confident, as he had every reason to be after 2 decades of virtually unbroken success, that the campaign would follow the familiar pattern of advance, devastation, and capitulation. What he found at the hill of Cervera, near Clunia, on the Castilian-Andalusi frontier, was something he had not prepared for. Sancho García had assembled not merely a Castilian force, but a genuine coalition, Castilians, Navarrese, and Leonese together, positioned on an elevated, naturally fortified promontory that offered commanding views of the surrounding terrain and made a conventional assault almost impossible. The Christian forces had good intelligence. They knew Almanzor's likely route of march and had chosen their ground accordingly. Almanzor's own intelligence on this occasion had failed him completely. When he realized the situation, he convened a war council to discuss how to defeat the Christian coalition. His commanders argued, but no consensus emerged. On July 29th of the year 1000, before the Muslims had resolved their disagreement or properly organized their position, Sancho launched his attack. The Christian cavalry struck both flanks simultaneously. The right flank of the Muslim formation began to buckle under the pressure, men falling, others breaking from their positions and fleeing. For the first time in his career, Almanzor faced what looked like certain defeat. He sat on a hillock watching, praying, trembling. Everything he had built across 2 decades of relentless campaigning was crumbling before his eyes. And then he made a move that was as risky as it was inspired. He ordered his camp dismantled and moved to the promontory where he himself was positioned. He threatened to punish anyone who was slow to obey. When the Christian cavalry saw movement behind Almanzor's position, they thought fresh reinforcements had arrived. They hesitated. They began to pull back. The men who had caused this sudden reversal were cooks, servants, grooms, and jesters, non-combatants whose repositioning had been mistaken for the arrival of a relief force. It was, in the fullest sense of the word, a bluff. And the deception worked. Almanzor's sons, Abdelmalik and Sanchuelo, seized the moment, leading the Berber cavalry in a hard counterattack into the confusion. The Christians, who had brought ropes to the battlefield to bind their expected prisoners, found themselves being bound by those same ropes as they fled. The Muslim losses were heavy, more than 700 dead. Because of that, Almanzor did not press into the Castilian heartland. His army rested through Ramadan in Zaragoza before staging a face-saving raid on the kingdom of Pamplona on the way home. Though it almost turned into a disaster for the Andalusis, the victory at Cervera was real. Had the Christians not fallen for the deception, the history of al-Andalus might have taken a very different turn. Almanzor's final campaign and death. 2 years after Cervera, Almanzor was dying. The gouty arthritis that had been consuming his hands and feet for years had progressed to the point where he could no longer ride a horse. He traveled on a palanquin carried by 2 slaves. When the rumor spread through Córdoba that he had already died, he had the men responsible hunted down, his tongue cut out, and his body crucified. The Hajib of al-Andalus could not afford to appear weak, not even at the end. His final campaign in 1002 was the last assertion of the legitimacy that jihad had always provided for his regime. He raided along the Castilian frontier, taking captives, burning villages, and then turned east to the monastery of San Milán de la Cogolla, the most venerated sanctuary in La Rioja and the patron saint of Castile. Archaeology has confirmed the destruction by fire at the site around this time. It was an act of defiance against his own mortality as much as against the Christians, a demonstration that Almanzor was still to be feared. But he could not go much further. Somewhere on the road back south, his body gave out. He was transferred to his litter and carried to Medinaceli, the former stronghold of his ally and later enemy, Galip. He died there on the night of August 9th, 1002, at the age of 64. He was buried in the fortress courtyard. The inscription carved on his tomb read, quote, "His deeds will tell you of him, as if you were seeing him with your own very eyes. By God, the world will never again produce anyone like him, nor will any other defender of the frontiers ever compare to him." End quote. The Historia Silense, written by Christian monks who had lived through the consequences of his campaigns, offered a rather different epitaph. The demon that had dwelt within him had seized his life and carried him off to hell. He was succeeded as Hajib by his son Abdelmalik al-Muzaffar, who will continue the Amirid campaigns for another 6 years. But the regime his father had built was already living on borrowed time, as we will see in the next episode. The verdict. Almanzor was, by any measure, the most military successful leader al-Andalus ever produced. He sacked virtually every city in Christian Iberia. He forced the kings of León and Pamplona to pay tribute and kneel before him. He reconquered Coimbra and held it. He broke the county of Castile's southern frontier and held those gains for 15 years. The supremacy of al-Andalus during his rule was a political and military reality that no Christian ruler of the time could seriously contest. And yet, the verdict of his legacy from an Islamic point of view is complicated because Almanzor's methods contain the mechanisms of al-Andalus's future destruction. The military reform that made his campaigns possible demilitarized Andalusian society and created a permanent fracture between those who governed and those who were governed. The fiscal pressure required to maintain his war machine generated the popular resentment that would explode after his death. The thousands of Berbers he settled in al-Andalus, bound by tribal rather than civic loyalty, became the building blocks of the Taifa kingdoms that shattered caliphal unity within a decade of his passing. Abu Bakr al-Turtusi put it with the precision of a man surveying the wreckage. Almanzor's policies were bread today and famine tomorrow. Military supremacy purchased with borrowed time. The victorious in the end left behind a civilization that was less capable of defending itself than the one he had inherited. That is the paradox at the heart of his legacy, and it is what makes him one of the most fascinating figures in the history of medieval Iberia. And with that, the verdict ends. If you enjoy the way I tell history, please subscribe to the YouTube channel or podcast, check out the Spanish channel as well, and support me financially on Patreon in exchange for benefits like early access to all my content or exclusive merchandise. The next episode in the chronological series will cover the rule of Abd al-Malik al-Muzaffar between 1002 and 1008, just before the civil war that brought the Caliphate of Cordoba to its end. Follow me so you don't miss it, and until next time!